Okay, good morning and afternoon, and welcome to those joining us for today's discussion, Designing an Energy Strategy for an Unstable Grid. Today, we are premiering what will be a series of 20 to 40-minute conversations, followed by Q&A covering heavy industry topics that span the evolution of modern controls, industrial AI technology applications, and advanced process control, an application of which you'll hear more about today. The series discusses how each of these are giving businesses across heavy industry an edge in today's market. The intent of these sessions are to turn what can feel like very complex, top-of-mind topics into something that feels approachable and actionable. My name is Lauren Contreras, and I head up product marketing for CrossnoKaye's platform, Atlas, and I'm happy to be joining you all as your host and moderator for today. To ensure that everybody gets the most out of today's discussion, I want to take a minute to help you get acquainted with the tools that you have to participate. From right to left in your toolbox, you'll see the words chat, questions, and polls. If you have anything to blurt out throughout the presentation, we welcome you to use the chat. But for any questions you'd like us to directly answer or prioritize, please use the questions tab. Jesse has prepared a very thoughtfully approached presentation. So while we won't be pausing to answer questions until the end, we encourage you to throw your questions out there so that one, you don't forget what those questions are, but two, those questions give the rest of the audience an opportunity to help prioritize and upvote them throughout Jesse's presentation. So while we wait for a few more people to trickle in, I'm going to start with a few short polls. So navigate over to your polls tab when you get a moment, and we will begin. Okay, if your energy strategy were a weather forecast, what would it be right now? All right. Okay. This is helpful, and I know some more people are going to be joining in the next few minutes. All right, partly cloudy. Most of everybody here is partly cloudy, some uncertainty, but manageable. That's good. Storm incoming, bracing for impact, and few, but sunny and stable, no complaints. I love that. I'm glad to see that there's no like full-on tornadoes and asking people to send for help. Okay. Now for the next poll. How long have you been working in energy management or operations that's leading you to be interested in learning more about how to create a better strategy? Great. We've got about half of you with 10 plus years of experience. That's excellent. We need more of you. 27% less than 2 years. All right, so we have that divide there. All right, let's move on to the next poll. What's your organization's current approach to energy procurement? We got fixed rate contracts for budget certainty, a mix of fixed and market-based pricing, block and index, mostly market-based spot pricing, or we don't have a formal energy procurement strategy at this time. Okay. And it might mean that also you're not exactly sure what your company is doing currently. But half of us don't have a formal energy procurement strategy, with about 30% seeing block and index and the rest fixed rate. contracts for certainty. And we'll be addressing some of that today. All right, and then the last one. What's your biggest concern heading into the next 12 to 18 months, right? I mean, think about the summer is coming. Depending on the location of your facility, might be a lot of coincident peaks. So here we are, price volatility and unpredictable costs, grid reliability and outage risk, regulatory or compliance changes, and making the case internally for capital investment to invest in solutions to help you, solutions or services to help you with your energy management. Okay. All right. Mostly grid reliability and outage risk, making the case internally for capital investment. I hear you. All right. Let's go ahead and move on. We'll come back to some polls and Q&A at the end. I want to introduce our expert for today. So our industry expert is Jesse Tootell, Director of R&D at Lineage, the world's largest temperature-controlled industrial REIT and logistics solution provider. He leads new technology development and energy market strategy to help optimize Lineage's energy portfolio globally. His team's work has earned multiple awards and patents for novel energy initiatives, including the U.S. Department of Energy's Better Practice Awards for 3 straight years. I think it's pretty fair to say that the energy market is one of the most complex systems modern businesses depend on. So complex, in fact, that entire professions and technology stacks exist just to interpret it. So, Jesse, welcome. You have a rare talent in this space and a gift for making the complicated feel understandable without actually oversimplifying it to the problem into something that it isn't. So I appreciate you bringing your perspective here to the Wire audience today. Welcome. We're excited to learn from you, and I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. Appreciate you guys having me, and hopefully I can deliver on the simplifying complex ideas concept throughout this talk. Happy to be here, everyone. I'm glad that you guys didn't see the pre-recorded version of this. My wife's gonna give birth any day now, so there was a chance we were gonna not be able to have a chat today, but I'm glad we're gonna be able to do this live. So this talk is intended to give kind of a current state of the grid as I see it. It's focused on the U.S. It's focused on deregulated markets, especially. But I'll just kind of walk through some of the trends that I'm seeing, how they impact large industrial businesses and energy users, and then get into some specific use cases where we at Lineage have had some successes in being able to mitigate that risk, and talk a little bit about more kind of where we see the grid going, and then we'll open it up for questions. Feel free to use the chat if there's anything in particular that you guys want to press pause on, but and we can revisit it towards the end. So I'm sure many of you are aware what the grid price currently is looking like. You're all involved in your businesses. You're seeing what's happening. This is energy prices since 2018. You have the invasion of Ukraine in there, that giant spike, but you're seeing a lot more elevated prices, right? And there's a lot of causes of this. Aging infrastructure, increasing demand. We'll get into a lot more of this too. The way that different states and ISOs are dealing with incentives around renewable energy or other types of assets. And then, just that net result is leading to a lot more volatility and a lot less certainty on the grid and how it's going to perform. This is monthly volatility of energy prices. You see, even, as costs may or may not be going up and down, the volatility that you're experiencing day to day is changing quite a bit. And with recent times being the highest volatility we've seen since 2018 and much further back. Before 2018 looks pretty much just like 2018 for about 10 years. And so, the key there is that the average price you're looking at is not the whole story, right? You need to be aware of what your hourly exposure is looking like. One big driver of this, though not the sole driver, certainly, this is the number of billion-dollar disaster events in the United States. So across the years since 1980, inflation plays a role here, but in general, you're seeing the trend where there have been a lot more severe events that are leading to grid instability, high prices, things like that throughout the grid. This is not going to get better anytime soon. This is sort of a trend we're seeing. It's driven by a whole lot of other science conversations, but for this talk, just kind of take my word for it that it's going to remain at least where it is now. And if you're in areas that have exposure to these, it's going to be something you're going to need to pay more attention to. I mentioned the aging grid infrastructure. There are a lot of things going on here that are negative for the end user of the grid. Transmission and delivery, about 70% of the US transmission lines are over 25 years old. The infrastructure that it's built on top of that, average large power transformer age, is over 40 years. And that's where 90% of the electricity that everybody uses goes through those large power transformers. Demand is the critical point, and it's one worth kind of pausing on. About 25% increase in demand by 2030 and 78% increase in demand by 2050 relative to today. That is almost entirely electrification of vehicles. So, grid infrastructure around car charging, truck charging, and then more importantly, data centers. So this is something where, the demand is vastly outpacing the supply, but it's not just about the supply, it's also about the infrastructure that provides that power to the users. And then on the supply side, there's a lot of intermittent, kind of volatility around, a lot of solar, you see this in Texas and California and a lot of other states where, solar and batteries have made a big charge in the space. But there's still volatility and gaps in production that are needing to be filled by, more traditional assets. Coal has been taken offline. That's by and large a good thing, although it seems to be kind of coming back in the form of clean coal, which we can talk about too. But there are just a lot of challenges the grid is facing, and the net result for all of us is that we end up seeing that volatility and price increase on the grid on our energy bill. Recent example from this year, Winter Storm Fern, which is a polar vortex event in the Northeast. This is looking at the beginning of January through the first couple of days of February of this year, and you see these prices here. These are daily average prices. These are daily average prices from Pennsylvania, Maryland. A bunch of these ISOs, PJM, BGE, and others, PSEG, where all of a sudden, everything gets super cold. The storm comes through, and you see these prices start to elevate. A traditional, typical average price here, is around $45. Maybe up to 300 in some of these markets. And this was about a 5 to 8x increase, relative to the average. And $2,000 per megawatt hour on the y-axis here is the legal limit for all of these ISOs and all these grids in PJM territory. And then you also see this weird trend here where the green on the lower right is ComEd, and it was going negative. And so this is just another thing where ComEd has very specific generation stack. They invested a lot more in nuclear, and there's kind of some other interesting dynamics there where they're selling to the neighboring grids. But this is a great example of the type of volatility that we all have to manage in our businesses. Another kind of classic example now, and it's been a few years, was Texas in 2021. This was, if any of you had businesses that were operating in Texas, you were aware of it. We had prices spike to $9,000 a megawatt hour when they're usually between $40 and $55 a megawatt hour during this time. And, I won't get into this chart too much, but basically this is the frequency of the grid, which is something that they have to regulate very closely, and that a lot of new programs are really gearing towards trying to manage with participation from other users. If it drops below 59.4, you're in terrible trouble. And if it drops below 59.3, the grid basically trips off. And we came within a few minutes of going below 59.3 until, some very aware managers of the grid just turned everything off. But if it had dropped below that line, Texas probably would have been without power for at least a month, potentially 2 or 3 in certain areas. For example, just as context from our personal experience at Lineage, we had one site that typically had a power bill of about 200 grand a month. During this month, this is a February when this happened, and we had exposure. If we had not done anything, our power bill would have been 1.8 billion, or sorry, $1.8 million that month. To just give you a sense of kind of the drastic nature of some of these outcomes. But this is a combination of extreme weather, where they had a uncharacteristic cold snap, and infrastructure constraints. And this was an issue with weatherization. There were natural gas pipes that were freezing. There were windmills that were icing up and stopping because they hadn't been weatherized for winter. And it's just kind of another example of another state that has this type of issue. So what can we do about it? This talk is about solutions, right? The first couple slides are to kind of show you what's going on and be a little scary, but there's lots of things we can do about it. This is my perspective on this. Spent a lot of time in procurement. If you're not exposed to volatility, you're overpaying for energy, right? I think that's a critical message for today. Most companies prefer budget certainty, right? And understandably so. That's what you want for your budgets, especially as public companies. That's what you really care about hitting. But budget certainty is an insurance policy in the energy market. If you're doing a fully fixed load following energy contract where you're de-risking it entirely for yourself, you're often paying a premium of maybe 20 to 70%. And that's because when you pay someone else to take the risk, they're going to charge you for it. And it is something, it's an insurance policy. And if you don't feel that you're able to take that risk off the table or manage the risk yourself, that makes sense. But it is something that you can optimize, right? And de-risk yourself. The risk, the volatility, the rising costs, they're all going to happen. And they're going to get progressively worse until some point in the future where the grid gets sorted out, where the major investments in the infrastructure are made to take care of those aging assets I talked about. When demand is supply is finally able to keep up with demand, but that's sometime in the future. It's not now. And the basic question to ask, I think, is is that insurance cheaper than training and strong investments in your infrastructure and team? And a really important kind of concept here, this top right plot, which is something that is worth kind of just driving home for a second. If you're taking full exposure on the market, you need operational or other assets to help you mitigate that full exposure. It's a good question. Just saw come through the chat. We'll get into that a little bit later about who to hold accountable for all this. But when fully fixed coverage, you're guaranteeing yourself a higher cost. It might not be as high as it could have been if you're riding the real-time spot market, but you are guaranteeing a higher cost than if you tried to just find some optimal hedges or operational profile within that space. So as I see it, this is kind of the new normal for us as large industrial users on the grid. If you're not making active decisions to change how you're interacting with the market, then you're just going to be at the whim of volatility. I think a lot of us probably have experience with having those months where things just kind of go wrong, and we see what's going on with it. Facilities don't need to be grid dependent anymore. That's kind of a critical point I'll touch on in the next slide. There's opportunity in this market chaos. So I'll talk a little bit more about some of the programs that different ISOs have. And again, I'm talking about deregulated markets in the US right now. So, parts of CAISO, ERCOT, PJM, MISO, the whole, kind of Eastern Seaboard. But there are a lot of opportunities even in regulated utility markets. So, if you're on SoCal Edison, for example, there are opportunities for you to still participate and still get money, savings out of it. And then I think, the kind of the tagline that I would want to drive home for everybody is that nimble energy users will win. If you're able to be flexible in your load usage, or if you're able to have assets that allow you to appear flexible to the grid, batteries, other generation assets, then you're going to be able to minimize your costs. And we'll get into a little bit about how we approach that at Lineage and how I sort of see that. So these are some solutions that we've approached at Lineage, and I think many of you probably have as well at your own businesses. So the critical point here, I think, is that this system becomes very complex very quickly. And if you are going to try and optimize it, you can't do it as just a person or a set of people, right? You need computers, you need analysis. And I think it's a bit self-serving for me as someone who's on the data science and R&D side to say this, but I don't believe it can be done well without analytics and without an investment into, if not an internal investment in your team, at least a partnership. We'll talk a little bit more about CrossnoKaye in a few slides here, where these very complex data sets and problems can be kind of distilled down into actionable things that you can do. But financial forecasting and modeling is a big one. We'll talk a little bit about that too. That's ultimately the impact we're all trying to drive here, right? In addition to potentially some carbon goals that some of us have, but it requires optimization. It requires a deeper level of understanding, and then it requires training, right? If you have site teams that don't understand what volatile energy prices mean for their their P&L at the end of the month, then they're going to operate in a way that they think is best for operations. For us, it's keeping food cold, it's scheduling truck appointments. But if they're going to just randomly peak their demand during the most expensive time of the day, then that's not going to work for anyone. And then in general too, it's complicated in terms of the different solutions across the different ISOs that we all operate in. There is no one size fits all solution, but there are very flexible solutions that can apply to across the board. This is an example. Just these plots are a proprietary microgrid control system that we developed, and it's basically taking into account the daily load profile of our building on the lower left, our solar production, which is variable. It has a pretty wide distribution of what can happen during different months, different if there's clouds over it, whatever. And then kind of an example here of the energy price across these different ISOs, independent system operators. I realized I've been using that acronym a lot without explaining it. That's the group that runs the electrical grid in each of those places. So the ISO in PJM, for example. And then we've leaned on some reinforcement learning algorithm approaches to try and make that a scalable solution, but it's relatively complicated to do, but it does seem to be working. So now into some more concrete examples, and this is something where we're kind of showing off our partnership with CrossnoKaye and the Atlas control system. So this was in 2025. This is a heat wave this time, not a cold snap. This is where we saw, excuse me, Atlas was able to reduce our load automatically during these really high price spike events by about 7 megawatts on average across these 3 days. And this was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars to Lineage in terms of the savings that we generated here. And it's the largest fully AI controlled load shed in any heavy industrial setting, as far as we know. If anybody on the call knows of a different one or a bigger one, let us know. But this is a combination of a couple different sites. And you can see, when you get multiple sites in your portfolio to all act the same way, there's a really powerful lever there in terms of mitigating costs when you have something pretty crazy happening like this. We have another example here of the polar vortex, and I'll spend some time on this one just as kind of a deeper use case. So this was that plot I showed you at the beginning of the talk, where we had the January into early February Winter Storm Fern polar vortex event. Prices were spiking, volatility was spiking. It was going up to the legal maximum limit. And this is the Atlas control system automatically shutting down one of the sites in the Mid-Atlantic. We had 37 demand response over the course of this entire this entire storm and across our sites and that were exposed to it in PJM, we had 37 demand response events, which occurred over about 52 different hours over 21 sites that we have across this section of the United States. And this total net value to us, which was the total value delivered, which included net savings but also demand response revenue, was about $351,000, and it all occurred within basically what you see here is about a week. And so this is the power of kind of having a solution like this. This is a big reason we're excited about our partnership with CrossnoKaye and deploying Atlas. But it's just showing you also how active it is. When things like this happen, this is a tough thing to manage with emails and text messages and phone calls, which is what I was doing during that Texas 2021 event. Being able to automatically do it in a safe and reliable way that also manages these other parts of it, like demand. Shutting down a building is one thing, turning it back on without spiking in demand is another thing. But it's done in such a way that it minimizes costs, and we saw a really good benefit from it. To break it down a little bit more, about the net new savings there was about 140,000, and the demand response revenue we expected to get out of that was about 211,000. So I'll briefly kind of stay here for a minute and talk about some of these market mechanisms that hopefully are interesting to the group here. A lot of times you'll hear these things called ancillary markets, and so there's different buckets in ancillary markets there are different mechanisms and ways to get money out of responding to the grid. There's energy market participation, which is just basically doing a lot of what we see here in this plot, avoiding real-time market spikes. So when the price of energy spikes in real time, you want to avoid that, reduce your load to mitigate your exposure to it. You also have demand management here, which is different than demand response. So in a market like PJM, you have coincident peak events, which are whenever the grid is most stressed, meaning that they have the highest demand and the lowest supply, or there's there's some sort of transmission delivery issue, there's something broken, whatever it is. In PJM, it's 5 of these per season, but in other states, it's 10 or 12. And what the grid does is they say, okay, these were the 5 worst events we had in terms of grid stress and grid cost, and they call those coincident peak events. And then they pass through to you, the user, what was your proportional contribution to the demand during those times. So if you were using 100% of your standard energy load during those times, you get a pretty big bill for coincident peak. If you were had a reduction in your load, like for example these shutdowns here, where we're pretty close to zero at this site, then you're going to get a very small coincident peak charge. And this is equivalent to demand charges in regulated utilities in a lot of ways. There it's your in SoCal Edison or one of these bundled utilities, you'll just get hit with your a demand charge for whatever your highest draw was during the month or during the interval that they care about. And this is a lot more flexible and it's tougher to predict, which is why people spend a lot of time and energy trying to manage it. And then so that's energy market participation. That's purely what you're doing, just responding to the grid. And the nice thing here is that when the grid is in trouble, they'll send high price signals, and that's a great way to respond and not only reduce costs, but you're also helping the grid out, right? The next one is capacity. So there's kind of 2 in here. There's reliability pricing, a reliability pricing model, and then traditional demand response. These are worth about $10,000 to $40,000 per megawatt year that you're able to participate in them. This is a preset agreement between you and the grid. I'm sure a lot of you do demand response, where they're going to call a demand response event, and you're expected to reduce your load by an agreed upon amount, and then you get paid for that, that agreed upon amount. Again, something that I'm sure a lot of you are doing here, but the nice thing is that they stack together, right? If you have real-time price spikes and coincident peak events, that's almost certainly going to be when a demand response event is called. So if you're already doing the first one, you might as well be doing the second one. There's two others that are occurring in PJM that are kind of representative of things that are becoming more popular, and more lucrative for energy users. The regulation program, so especially Reg D, this is really fast twitch regulation. And it's something that, on the order of $25,000 to $70,000 per megawatt year of value, but it's super fast, and so it's occurring, on the order of seconds within a 15-minute window. Its best use case or its best application is with batteries. So if you have batteries, you can participate this very easily, and it's actually net energy neutral over the course of a 15-minute interval, where this is where they're getting more into the frequency and voltage, or sorry, frequency regulation of the grid. That, that Texas chart I showed you, where if the frequency is dropping, they need to inject some load into the grid. If it's increasing, they need someone to take some off. And that's all, it sounds complicated, but if you have a battery and if you're working with the utility, and especially if you can automate the controls of that battery, then this is a potentially lucrative program that, you almost don't notice, because over the course of 15 minutes, Reg D will discharge and charge from your battery in equal amounts, and you'll end up with the exact same battery charge you had going into it. And then the last one is synchronized reserves. So this, I think, is kind of where I think a lot of industrial businesses should be heading and should be looking more closely at. This is only something that we're dipping our toes in at Lineage. It's relatively complex, but it is doable, especially with tools like Atlas, where it's very similar to demand response, but it's occurring on a faster time frame. So traditional demand response is usually 20 to 30-minute response. You get an automated signal, or you get an email from your demand response provider, and you reduce load, and then 20 to 30 minutes later, that's what matters, what you've done. Synchronized reserves is 10 minutes or less. And it can be done, obviously, with batteries. It can also be done with load if you have, sophisticated control and understanding of your assets. And that's worth another $25,000 to $70,000 per megawatt year. And again, just to hit this point, hit the nail on the head here one more time, all of those different ancillary markets I just talked about all tend to happen at the same time, and you can and you can stack your revenue streams from them. So, if you're all doing, energy market participation, great. If you're all doing capacity market, great. Take a look at some of these more advanced things, especially as you install batteries and advanced controls. And it's just a way to add more revenue to your existing, kind of grid participation stack. So boiling it down, I clearly have a pretty well-defined point of view on this. If you're not taking the market risk, you're paying for it, right? And that may be worth it to some businesses. If you're, especially depending on what your operational profile looks like, you may not be willing to be flexible in your load. You may not be willing to invest in things like solar, generators, batteries. But I do think it's worth reframing how to think about it. Especially for companies that have been doing their business a certain way for a long time. Pre 2019, there was it was pretty reasonable to just get a hedge and kind of pay that insurance, because there wasn't a lot of volatility to back it up and make it worse. But this kind of phrase, the energy isn't a utility anymore; it's a market. People think of it as, okay, I'm buying energy like I'm buying water. That's going to end up leading to increased costs and unexpected costs through time. So in my opinion, and what I'd encourage everybody to do, and what I hope we talk a bit about in a little bit at the end of this talk, I think there's a few key things. Enable grid-aware controls for facilities is a big one. And I've shown some examples of what Atlas can do, has done at our sites. That is, the best grid-aware control system that I've come across, and it's one we're really excited about. Embed load flexibility into operations. So this can include the ancillary markets that I talked about. But at the end of the day, I've often found there's a disconnect between, people that are managing operations of the business, so, of a site, whatever it might be, and people that are responsible for the energy usage of that site. For us, it's a, kind of a general manager operations and engineering team. Oftentimes they're in lockstep, and, there's no problem, but there are slightly different incentives there, and being sure that how they think about the operations and what investments are being made into the business are really all rowing the same direction in terms of kind of interacting with the energy grid to reduce costs. And then OpEx and CapEx strategies and a lot of the stuff, the poll at the beginning, it's not a unique perspective by any means for all of us to be concerned about how we get capital for projects, right? I doubt there's very many CEOs on the call right now or CFOs. We're all people working within these large businesses that are trying to do things that make the business better. But you do need to make a case for why an investment like this makes sense. And I think too, this is where analytics really becomes helpful, at least in my, the personal experience and the experience of my team. When you are able to quantify and really evaluate what the benefit of a project is, that's a much easier conversation to have. But there's also a lot of different ways to approach these. So, most people think, all right, I want solar on the roof. Let me either buy it myself or do it as a PPA. I think that there's a lot of interesting capital lease structures out there now. There are off balance sheet structures. PPA is off balance sheet technically. So it doesn't appear as CapEx or debt. And that's a pretty attractive way for, a lot of businesses to get involved in that sort of asset. And so there's a lot more people in the space, a lot more, banks, private equity firms that are becoming financiers of these projects. And there's a lot of change that I've seen happen over the last, maybe 8 or 9 years in that space that are worth taking a look at if you haven't in a while. And then training. I mentioned the site operators, the people that are actually running the business. Understanding all of the things I've talked about here is pretty critical, right? It's a way to make sure that they are in line and their incentives are aligned with what's best for the business. If they're just focused on hitting budget, that's fine. But if they're incentivized to maybe take a little bit more risk and maybe try and participate in more of these energy programs, then I think that ends up being better, for everybody involved. Real quick too here, I wanted to just make a point about the demand side of things that I mentioned earlier. So data centers are by far the biggest draw, the current thing that is asking more of the grid than the grid can deliver. I'm sure most people here have heard the size of these data centers that the hyperscalers want to build are immense. They require many megawatts of power, gigawatts on the state level, and that is one of the biggest things that is the grid is struggling to meet, is this new demand in addition to trucks and cars that are getting electrified. But I think there's sort of an interesting thought experiment here where if you go, okay, great, let's take where we are right now. AI, the intersection of AI and the energy grid, it right now means that we're having higher volatility and higher costs on average. So right now we're in a high volatility, high cost environment, but eventually that balance will shift. Those things will intersect where, okay, sufficient, AI data centers have a sufficient amount of grids, grid supply now, and they can finally be starting to use to make the grid better. I think that's kind of undisputed that the utility space is a great space for AI application. There's, it's a very fast twitch, very complicated system. It requires a lot of optimization. I think that the AI will be used and applied in the utility space to make it better and solve some of the problems that it self created by needing the energy in the first place. But at some point, it'll get better, hopefully. If it doesn't, the grid collapses and we all have bigger problems. But at some point, there will be, kind of an easing of the grid stress as infrastructure investments are made, as AI is used to optimize the control and operation of it. And at that point, we'll be working in a grid that is AI enabled, right? And every communication that we have with the grid, every price point, market dynamic you'll be better off having an AI enabled system. And I'm using AI here pretty blatantly, but really just an automated computerized method of communicating with the grid is what I'm getting at. And so either way, either in the short term or the far term, we're going to benefit as large industrial energy users by being able to have, automated grid aware systems that respond to what the grid needs from us. And right now, we're being told in the way of price point, the grid is stressed, you see a high price, you respond to it, everyone wins. And in the future, I think it will be a lot more automated communication from the grid to industrial users like us that, will end up benefiting everyone. So that's kind of another thing in, investing in training bucket, it's worth bringing up there. It's not just the assets, it's not just the control system, it's also the team, and being able to make all three of those work together. So I have a few kind of thought points here, and we can hopefully get into them in the Q&A a little bit. And I'll pass it back off to Lauren here to kind of go through some of these, and maybe we can talk a bit more about each of these, or I'm happy to expound some more.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to get to that. Okay, I have a couple of things that I want to do right now. So I have actually taken some of these discussion points and I've put them in the questions tab, along with Douglas and Ellen have also posted questions. So we have Mary as well. Please go ahead and take a look at these questions. What you have the ability to do is upvote them. You'll see that little arrow there. And as things get upvoted, we'll start kind of answering those questions kind of from top to bottom and go from there. At the same time, I'd like to invite to the stage Blake Pollard. He leads CrossnoKaye's applied science team, which powers the company's innovation engine by applying data science, optimization, and machine learning and AI to solve critical challenges facing industries worldwide. So he is one of the engineering minds behind Atlas's solution that you heard about today. So prior to joining CrossnoKaye, Blake was a National Research Council postdoctoral fellow at the National Institute of Standards and Technology and holds a PhD in physics from the University of California, Riverside. So welcome to the discussion, Blake. If you want to go ahead and join the stage. And while we wait for Blake to join the stage, I'm going to ask everybody just their opinion really quickly with a poll. We're really trying to identify we have a lot of really important topics that we feel are very relevant that we want to bring to you all. And we just want to make sure that it works with your timing. So can we launch the poll that asks you about questions? So if you go over to the polls section, if we're going to be planning future sessions like this, what format works for you, right? Today, we're kind of keeping it at like a 45 minute level with Q&A. Is it something that would be better achieved with 30 minutes, quick hit, or both, depending on the topic? Lastly, just send me the recording. I know that this is something that people like to do maybe also in their own time, and everything that we have, we will be making on demand.
Hey there, everyone. I just want to say thanks for the intro, Lauren.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for joining the conversation. Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody, for giving me some feedback on this. And let's go ahead. Let's take it away. We are going to start the question right at the top. Douglas. Okay. So in refrigerated environment, I'm actually going to start a live answer here. So in a refrigerated environment, what are the most common loads you reduce or shut off, or strategies you use to reduce demand and still meet temperature requirements of the facility? I'm actually going to hand, I believe this could be like an Atlas answer, but yeah, maybe they're
asking. I think Blake's well suited to that one to take a first crack at it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks for the question, Douglas. Yeah, so I mean, we have a lot of different things we do, but the kind of core driver of the load shifting capabilities that we use for, some of these high cost avoidance events is that, we track and model the kind of cooling requirements for the facility over, different windows, whether it's a day or a few hours or whatever time frame is really critical. And because these cold storage warehouses have such large thermal masses, a lot of them can have, some of the refrigerated spaces like shut off for, several hours. And so they might have a few sections that are like more critical, have more, tight requirements. And so we'll typically deploy a strategy that like, understands which loads are curtailable and like what their constraints are, right? What are the no touch hours? But the primary thing driving it is that the algorithms we run, try to predict and then meet a certain cooling load demand across a certain interval, and then like schedule shutdowns or curtailments accordingly. So, every space has like a set of temperature ranges that they have to operate within, and the models just are always, scheduling in order to try to maintain those constraints while also curtailing. And so we'll basically have systems that can maybe shut off, 60% of their refrigeration load for several hours, and that'll be like the kind of primary driver of the load shifting. In addition, a lot of these facilities, depending on how, well they're networked, have like electric underfloor heaters or, forklift chargers and other loads that are like more readily curtailable that aren't necessarily part of like the main refrigeration system.
Yeah, and Douglas, if you have any follow-up questions, go ahead and post them. I know that Blake and I could talk about this for hours on end, so keep going. All right, the next question we have is it going okay? Is from Thomas Holy. What is the actual synergy with electric and thermal storage? The obvious things to me are actually, let me put it up here live. Thermal timescale basically provides a buffer for playing ancillary higher frequency dynamics. B, extending thermal flywheel with electric kWh. C, overall increased predictability control. Did I miss anything?
Tommy, good to see you. I don't think so. I mean, Blake, if you have an answer to this, feel free. But there is a benefit in cold storage of the thermal storage. And there's a lot of other businesses that don't have that. But it really just comes down to how you optimize what you're hoping to get out of it. If you have efficiency goals that those might not necessarily align with a lot of thermal flywheeling, which for anybody that doesn't know that term, thermal flywheel, what we're talking about is just essentially pre-cooling the warehouse, making it extra cold so that when you turn it off, it slowly warms back up and stays under temperature set point, and using the thermal inertia that Blake was talking about to kind of ride out more expensive times of day. But Blake, anything you want to add to this? I think this question could use some unpacking.
Also nice to see you, Tommy. And I think you explained it pretty well, Jesse. Like the primary drivers, the thermal inertia of these facilities definitely enables those kind of like curtailment events. So that kind of covers these high cost avoidance periods. The one maybe interesting interplay I think we see is with both on-site generation as well as on-site storage. Like, so if they have actually a battery storage on site, that's an example where then we can kind of do a little bit of that microgrid optimization and start to target other components in different ways. Some of those is just like using solar generation excess, in the refrigeration system during those solar production hours to then do this kind of pre-cooling to enable the flywheeling in the expensive evening hours. But another really interesting one we've seen at some facilities is where, working with a battery that can, as you're pointing out, Tommy, do some of these higher frequency dynamics that like we can actually achieve pretty good overall demand stabilization. So just minimizing the maximum demand charge, like Atlas in conjunction with a battery can typically, find that right level for your demand and keep it really, really flat. So, some of these facilities, especially out in California, have pretty high max demand charges. And so, that becomes an interesting one that you can kind of combat more effectively if you're paired with, the thermal storage and the electrical storage.
Yeah, and the last thing on this that just occurred to me too when you mentioned that, Blake, was of all the industries, I think that when you have the thermal mass like that, it has the best opportunity to potentially participate in the fast twitch programs that I mentioned, those ancillary programs. Especially if you have a bit of that buffer in your operational load profile that you can do something in less than 10 minutes with.
Okay. As I go ahead and bring up the next question from Emre, I'm also going to post something here. If anybody's interested in speaking to our team in more detail about Atlas and what we can do for your particular company, your portfolio, you can go ahead and press this to learn more. And we have a team that's waiting by to be able to answer your questions. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Emre, and we're going to answer the question here. What percentage of total energy costs did the 350,000 saved represent? What was the ROI for implementing the system, including the cost of the people side? As you mentioned, training and teams. Lineage is a huge company. How big does the energy use need to be for it to make sense?
Yeah. So I will do my best to, without the spreadsheets in front of me, to kind of accurately represent this. Our energy cost is right around 5.5% of revenue per year. So it's not, our labor is by far our biggest cost center, and then energy. In terms of what percent that total, that 351, whatever it was, saved, that's, I mean, I don't want to overpromise here, but it's definitely a meaningful percentage of the monthly bill that month across those sites. I don't think it's north of 20, but I wouldn't be surprised if we're close. I think somewhere in the 20% range is about what we're seeing on average for savings of Atlas. In that particular month, it may have been more than that because of the demand response revenue we were also able to generate. Cost of the people side, that is an interesting one. I think that in general, we've been using a lot of internal resources combined with the resources at CrossnoKaye to educate our team. So we already have some people who are dedicated energy specialists, myself included. We have the R&D team. If you don't have that, there's a lot of resources available to you. CrossnoKaye is obviously very willing to spend time and explain the things that they're doing with their product, and they can dive through the ROI. Depending on how you structure it, it's been a no-brainer for us. We've been seeing savings that make it a very accretive project for us, which I'm happy to dive into in maybe a more private setting. But I think that the balance between how much expertise you have inside your company versus outside your company will determine how you lean towards that training. I've done trips to Texas after that big Texas event where I just went and sat down with all the regional maintenance managers and a bunch of the maintenance managers of the sites and kind of talked about what happened, and that was a training day. And sure, that cost a few $1,000s to make me go do that, but compared to the numbers we're talking about, it's small potatoes.
Yeah, something that I'd like to add here is on top of CrossnoKaye's platform and technology that is Atlas, right, and how we deliver that to our customers, we do have this really interesting kind of diversity of thought that we have within our company that we then provide as services and teams, right? So when you're working with Atlas, we understand that this is a big challenge that companies are facing. So we provide training, we do a little bit of that hand-holding, right, to help, whether that is refrigeration expertise, controls expertise, energy expertise, right, data science expertise. We have all of this in-house. It is the combination of that thought leadership and our customers is what propels our product and why it's been so successful. And to what Jesse was saying earlier, that what we see across companies that are utilizing our products is that across a portfolio, on average, companies are seeing about 21% energy cost savings. So I'm going to move over to Ellen's question here. Oh my gosh, I didn't mean to do that. Let me see. Here we go. Didn't mean to do that. So here, Ellen has a question here. How do your operation staff feel about these automated load sheds? Does it add to their workload?
It's a good question. Early on, like 9 years ago when we first started kind of trying to change load and figure this stuff out and get people to shut buildings off, we used to call it Bud Light diplomacy, where we would go to the site and we would take the guy out for a couple of beers and convince him it was a good idea to shut the system off for a few hours. We've come a long way from that, and I think that in general, there's a lot of site staff, operation, engineering, for our team, the maintenance managers, engineers, and I think we have a couple of them on the call too, so I don't want to speak for them, but I think in general, they get a lot more incentivized to do it when they see the P&L result. And so when you have savings that, they see the benefit of actually doing it, it doesn't feel like extra work or extra attention that's required. And the nice thing is that, when at sites with Atlas, it's less time for them. They're spending a lot less time on the screen, on the computer for the control system. And they can check things on their phone, right? Like it used to be that if you had a temperature spike on the weekend, you'd get up at whatever time it was and head in and figure it out. But the visibility is another big time saver. But in general, it does require some change management. I'm not going to sugarcoat that too much. I think that there is, there are a lot of incentives and a lot of ways to, more easily do it now than in the past, but it's going to change how they operate their site, and they're going to have to learn a little bit and adjust to it. But in general, I wouldn't say it adds to their workload. I think that partnership with Atlas actually takes away from their workload.
Okay. Yeah, we actually just did a presentation, CrossnoKaye and Lineage together with Better Buildings, Better Plants for the Department of Energy, where Carlos Vasquez and Blake got to kind of speak about that subject in particular, Ellen. So I may send you that link so you can hear from actually the person who manages teams of these operators, what his point of view really is about that and how that's been helpful.
Carlos is a good one.
Yeah, Carlos is great. Okay, we have I see Thomas here. I'm going to put this one up here. Have you guys done any virtual bundling of facilities, like a VPP approach that would at the least smooth demand by averaging, but I can imagine lots of benefits? Are utilities open to such things?
So I think, the obvious bundling is demand response. When we get a demand response aggregator and we sign up a bunch of sites with them, they can then take all those sites together as one, chunk of load that they will then go interact with the utility with. In terms of like a VPP is virtual power plant, I'm assuming that is not something we've seen as much benefit to really entertaining on the demand side versus the supply side. Like you would get, virtual power plant or VPPA with a solar farm or something like that. But I think at the end of the day, the sites are far enough apart that they're operating in different substations. And so if you tried to act like they were all one thing, the grid would experience it still as many different things from a demand perspective. And I just don't think that, that would really ultimately change kind of the way the grid thinks about the demand side enough. But so demand response, yes, but everything else, no.
Okay. All right. Well, unless we have one more question here. Let's see if there's anything. Okay. Thomas says thanks. Well, listen, thank you all for your time today. I hope that you came and got something out of this that you can apply or at least have a discussion about moving forward. We will be sending this recording out to you over the next day or so. I appreciate y'all. Thank you, Blake. Thank you, Jesse, for your participation and for all of your knowledge here today. I appreciate it.
Sure
Bye,
thing.
all.
Yep. Thanks, all.